Alzheimer's, which includes alcohol-related dementia, which includes Parkinson's-related dementia, which includes something called Lewy bodies dementia, which is the little things in your brain called Lewy bodies, which is more related to an aggressive form of dementia. So dementia is the umbrella term for all of those diseases, those conditions that impact our ability to think clearly, to have this executive function, etc. They are each different. In fact, Alzheimer's itself has many different types of conditions in them. There's something also called frontotemporal dementia. So that's what dementia is. Alzheimer's is the term used for 75 to 80% of those dementias. Because they are so similar, people are stopping, because it's almost the same, people are saying, and the treatment is the same in most cases, people generally are using dementia now versus Alzheimer's as the umbrella term, so we don't exclude those few people with dementia from a different type. The frontal lobe here is the place of executive function. Executive function is that part of the brain that organizes complex things. Dave over here, who was in charge of all this filming, turned to me and said, well, the way we do this and make these films is we take lots of pictures and then we put things all over the screen and then we vaguely look at them and then we put them together and eventually they come together and we have a show. He said, is that the way things work? That would not be, he couldn't do this if he had frontal lobe dementia. It would be too complicated to do. But your frontal lobe is doing fine, so keep it up. So the answer to the question is exercise, sleep, diet, meaning, and reduced stress don't require executive function capacity. And so it doesn't affect them, but they affect it. If you sleep well, your executive function works better. If you are not full of inflammation and you reduce the stress, your frontal lobe works better. So all of the executive function in the frontal lobe is one of the first things to be affected by the condition, which is why we use templates. So it doesn't affect your life necessarily. It might affect the complexity of what you're doing.
Thank you.
One of the problems is that we think that we as individuals have to care for another individual and that that's the right way to do things. And it is as long as we can do it. It is as long as that person remains in a setting that they're comfortable with. And it also is as good as long as we don't get sick and we don't adversely affect our own quality of life so much that we can't actually care for the other person. So the question is, if you believe, as I do, in communal care, such as is given at Jewish Home Life Community, such as Hearthstone does, such as we train in the Hearthstone Institute, the question is, how many people do you need to do this? So the answer to the question is, it depends on how big the community is. I visited a place called the Dementia Village in Hoogeweg, Holland, 3 weeks ago. They have small apartments throughout. They have 150 people in 23 six-person apartments. And in each of those six-person apartments, they have 2 people in the morning. So they have a very intense caregiving approach based on that. In something called the greenhouse program and small house program, which are about 14 or 15, they have 2 to 3 people for those 15, 2 people for those 15 people, so it's 1 to 7. In our communities, which are about 30, give or take, a little less or a little bit more, we run on a ratio that's about 5 or 6 to 1 during the day and a little bit less at night. But the ratio is less important than the training. The main thing that you have to do is this, if it's an intense ratio and the person doesn't say, would you like to run the bingo game, it doesn't really matter, right? So the ratio is, I don't know why the question was asked, but those are the numbers that people throw around. And also, in many cases, if you're asking other people what is the ratio, you really have to say, who are you counting? Do you count the person who's serving the meal? Do you count the maintenance crew? Do you count the managers or not? So it's a complicated arithmetic, but it depends mostly on how many people are in the residential community. At the end of every chapter in my book, I have 4 or 5 paragraphs that say, here's how you can do this at home. The hope stuff is a matter of reading and thinking and learning and understanding and relating to the people you love at home, to see who they are and to not be so frustrated that you miss the smile, or not be so frustrated that when the person, that you tell the person what to do, but rather you involve them and you take the time to involve them. But then the question is programs. So I have a chapter on the museum programs, on visual arts. And there I say, go to a museum, get some cards get 20 cards of paintings, show them to the person you're living with, look at the ones that he or she gets very excited about, say, okay, these 7 are the ones we're going to talk about. Go back to the museum, get 7 posters or 7 prints, and put those on the wall and say, now we've got a museum here, we're going to talk about them. Or if it's the movies, I used to say go to the DVD store. I think the new version says go turn on YouTube and look up skits and various things. Figure out what the connection is, what he or she is engaged with, and create your own movies program. So every one of the things I've talked about, even the learning program, could be done at home. And that's a matter of being creative and curious, but it all begins by saying, this person still can do things, and this person is still here. And that's the work. And I suppose the last part of that, doing stuff at home, is to make sure you have help. I don't necessarily mean paid help. It could be family help. It could be somebody. So, because taking it all on yourself, as some of us have discussed, is just impossible. And so doing it at home, that's why sometimes this communal living settings like Jewish Home Life Communities or us or others that we work with solves that problem. It's the disastrous dyad that is the problem at home, because it just gets very, very burdensome. I have done some training with faith-based communities, because I find a lot of times that those faith-based communities actually don't even treat people with the dementia, don't even include them in the services, whereas the procedural learning we know means that a lot of the ceremonies and a lot of the rituals of any faith are critical to their memories and to their sense of self. So I have done them. We don't have a formal one because we haven't been asked, but I think if somebody said, how could we do that and could you develop one, we obviously would. And it would be much more, so I will tell you one, I did get a book recently that asked me to write an endorsement on the back cover. And it was a Catholic support group book, and it drew on the Bible, and it drew on 52 weeks of beautiful paintings that they got, of religious paintings from all over the world that were in the book. And there were Bible verses, and there were prayers, and there were poetry, and discussion topics. And the endorsement I wrote was, because she started off by saying this is all drawn from I'm Still Here, and I'm translating it into this particular faith. And I said, how am I going to write a reference that is so specific to one faith? And so what I wrote was, this is the right kind of thing to do and should be done in the Jewish community, in the Islamic community, in the Hindu community. Draw on whatever you can, but still understand that the basic philosophy is the person is still there and the person still can. And the person can draw on those faith-based feelings. So the first answer is you don't. That's actually the only answer. No, I'll give you an example of what I mean. So we have somebody who was part of our Learning for Life program and is now living with us, whose wife is actually on our foundation board. And when we first interviewed him at home, he said, this is my studio, I paint all the time. He was a graphic designer for a large research firm. And his wife looked at me and said, I looked at the person who was there, said, he hasn't painted in 10 years. When he joined Learning for Life, we set up a painting studio. He not only painted for 2 years, he also taught all the rest of the Learning for Lifers how to paint, and he became the teacher. And and now he's been painting ever since. So you don't necessarily have to turn people who are creative into menial tasks. They can do creative tasks. We had another man who was a pianist, And he played the piano all the time. And we had families come and complain. And they said he always plays the music from his childhood and from his kids' childhood. Why not ours? So I suggested that they bring in tapes to play while they're here. And I came back a few months later, and he was playing all new songs. They hadn't brought tapes in. They had brought new songs. I went up to him. I said, "These are all new songs. Did you learn them?" He said, "Yeah, but I'm having a little trouble with the sharps and the bass and stuff." I mean, you actually can always find something that can bring people's creativity to bear. And in another residence in Texas, we set up a law office for somebody who was an attorney, and he proceeded to give everybody in the community legal advice. I hope they didn't take it, but you know, so you got to be creative. You got to be creative.